the first thing they take from you isn't your freedom. It's your sense of time. Inside ADX Florence, a place often called the most secure prison in America, men don't measure days by clocks or calendars. They measure them by footsteps in the hallway, by the sound of a food slot opening, by silence that stretches so long, it begins to feel like pressure against the skull. Some inmates spend years without touching another human being. Some forget what a normal conversation sounds like. And some never come back the same. What happens inside those concrete walls is rarely seen, rarely spoken about, and almost impossible to imagine from the outside. But the deeper you go, the more unsettling the truth becomes. Because solitary confinement here isn't just punishment. It's a system. And what happens next is even harder to understand. ADX Florence was designed with one goal in mind: total control. Every detail of the facility, from its thick concrete walls to its window placement, serves that purpose. This isn't a prison built for rehabilitation. It's a prison built for containment. The men sent here are not typical inmates. Many are considered too dangerous, too influential, or too unpredictable to be held anywhere else. Some have led gangs from behind bars. Others have committed acts so severe that prison systems across the country refuse to house them. So they end up here. In a place where even the architecture is part of the punishment. Each cell is a sealed box. Solid concrete. Steel door. A narrow slit for food. A window designed not to show the outside world, but to prevent inmates from knowing exactly where they are. Orientation is stripped away. Control is absolute. And as the doors lock behind them, something else begins to happen. Something that doesn't show up in official reports. A typical cell inside ADX Florence is about the size of a parking space. Everything inside is fixed. The bed, the desk, the stool, all part of the concrete structure itself. Nothing can be moved. Nothing can be broken off easily. There's a toilet and a sink combined into one unit. A mirror made of polished metal. And a window so narrow, it doesn't show a view, just a sliver of sky. Inmates spend 23 hours a day inside this space. Alone. No cellmate. No physical contact. No shared air. At first, the silence feels unnatural. Then it becomes overwhelming. Then, it becomes something else entirely. Some inmates begin talking to themselves. Others create routines so rigid they resemble rituals. Counting steps. Tapping patterns on the wall. Repeating phrases just to hear a human voice, even if it's their own. Because in a place like this, the mind doesn't stay still for long. And what happens when it starts to slip is something most people never see coming. A day inside ADX Florence doesn't begin with a sunrise. It begins with a sound. The clank of metal against metal as a tray slides through the slot. Breakfast arrives without a word. No conversation. No eye contact. Just a brief interruption in the silence. After that, time stretches. Some inmates read if they have access to books. Others write letters that may take weeks to leave the facility. Many simply sit. Hours pass without movement. The only break in the routine comes with what's called recreation. But even that isn't what most people imagine. Recreation at ADX Florence means being escorted, alone, to another concrete enclosure. It's often described as a dog run. There is no grass. No equipment. Just walls, a floor, and a patch of sky visible through metal grating above. Inmates are allowed here for about an hour a day. Alone. Some pace in circles. Others stand still, letting the sunlight hit their face. For a moment they feel something close to freedom. But then the hour ends. And the door closes again. Back to the cell. Back to the silence. And for some, back to thoughts that are getting harder to control. Because what happens in isolation doesn't stay contained. It builds. Slowly. Quietly. And sometimes, dangerously. Human beings aren't designed for prolonged isolation. Inside ADX Florence, that reality becomes impossible to ignore. Inmates have reported experiencing hallucinations. Hearing voices. Seeing things that aren't there. Others describe a constant feeling of pressure, like their thoughts are looping, repeating, tightening. Sleep becomes irregular. Time becomes distorted. A day can feel like a week. A week can disappear entirely. And without interaction, without feedback from another person, the mind begins to lose its anchor. Some inmates develop coping mechanisms. Others don't. And when someone starts to break, there's no one in the cell to notice. Only guards passing by. Only cameras watching from above. And a system that prioritizes control over intervention. But what happens when control starts to slip, even for a moment? Officially, ADX Florence runs on strict procedures. Every movement is scheduled. Every action monitored. But inside the cells there are unwritten rules. Rules that inmates learn quickly, or suffer the consequences. Don't attract attention. Don't shout unless you have to. Don't disrupt the routine. Because attention here doesn't bring help. It brings restrictions. Loss of privileges. Less access to reading material. Less time outside the cell. And in some cases, even deeper isolation. So inmates adapt. They become quiet. Controlled. Invisible. But that doesn't mean they stop communicating. Because even in a place designed to eliminate connection, it still finds a way through. And the methods they use are more subtle than you might expect. Despite the isolation, inmates find ways to communicate. Through walls. Through pipes. Through patterns of tapping that form a kind of code. It's slow. Imperfect. But it works. A message can travel cell by cell, down an entire corridor. Sometimes it's just a greeting. Other times it's information. News from the outside. Warnings. Or simply a reminder that someone else is still there. Because in a place like ADX Florence, even the smallest connection can make a difference. But it also creates risk. Because communication, no matter how limited, is still a form of influence. And influence is something this prison was designed to eliminate. So when it happens, the response is swift. And often, harsher than expected. Breaking the rules at ADX Florence doesn't lead to typical discipline. It leads to deeper isolation. Inmates can be placed in even more restrictive conditions. Less light. Fewer possessions. Minimal human contact. Sometimes referred to as the box within the box. Time here becomes even harder to track. Even harder to endure. And yet, some inmates still push those boundaries. Not because they want to, but because the pressure inside the system builds to a point where silence itself becomes unbearable. And when that happens, the consequences don't just affect behavior. They affect survival. The staff at ADX Florence operate in a world just as controlled as the inmates. Every movement is procedural. Every interaction measured. There is no room for error. Because the individuals housed here are considered among the most dangerous. Guards are trained to maintain distance. To avoid unnecessary conversation. To treat every interaction as a potential risk. But over time, even they are affected by the environment. The silence. The repetition. The constant awareness that something could go wrong. Some describe it as emotionally draining. Others say it becomes routine. But no one leaves unchanged. Because working inside a place like this means witnessing what prolonged isolation does to a human being. Day after day. Year after year. And sometimes, watching it happen in real time. For many inmates, ADX Florence isn't temporary. It's indefinite. Years can pass without meaningful change. Some hope for transfer. Others stop expecting it entirely. Time loses its structure. And without structure, something else takes its place. Acceptance. Or resignation. But even then, a question remains. What does it mean to exist in a place where every day is the same? Where the outside world becomes distant, almost unreal? And where the only constant is confinement? Because the answer to that question doesn't just define the inmates. It defines the system itself. And what it reveals is something most people never consider. No one arrives at ADX Florence by accident. The journey here is deliberate and final in a way most inmates understand immediately. Transfers are quiet. No announcements. No explanations beyond what's necessary. An inmate is removed from one system and delivered into another, one that operates on an entirely different level of restriction. Some arrive after acts of extreme violence inside other prisons. Others come because of influence, because even behind bars, they were still able to command power, organize, control. Here that ends. Or at least, that's the intention. The moment they step inside, the system begins to strip away everything that could be used to assert dominance. No contact. No gatherings. No shared space. Just isolation. And yet, something unexpected happens. Even in total separation, identity doesn't disappear. It adapts. And sometimes, it hardens. Power inside ADX Florence doesn't look the way people expect. There are no visible hierarchies. No groups standing together. No open displays of control. But influence can still exist. Through letters. Through coded language. Through messages that pass beyond the walls, even when the sender never leaves their cell. Every piece of mail is screened. Every word examined. But language has a way of hiding meaning in plain sight. A phrase that seems ordinary can carry instruction. A simple greeting can signal alignment. And for some inmates, maintaining that connection to the outside world becomes the last form of control they have left. But it's fragile. One mistake, one suspicion, and communication can be cut off entirely. Because here, even influence is treated as a threat. And when that threat is removed, what's left is something far more difficult to confront. There comes a point, for some, when the outside world fades almost completely. Memories become less vivid. Voices of loved ones harder to recall. Even language begins to feel distant. Without interaction, without new experiences, the mind turns inward. At first, it replays the past. Moments, decisions, regrets. But over time, those thoughts begin to loop, repeat, distort, and eventually, they lose their connection to reality. Some inmates describe feeling like they're disappearing. Not physically but mentally. Like their identity is being worn down by repetition and silence. Others cling to routine with absolute precision. Wake, sit, read, count, repeat. Because routine becomes the only structure left. The only defense against something they can't fully explain. But what happens when even that structure starts to fail? There are moments inside ADX Florence that never appear in official summaries. Moments when the pressure builds beyond control. An inmate shouting into silence. A sudden outburst that echoes through the tier. A reaction that seems to come from nowhere, but has been building for months or even years. These are the breaking points. They don't always look dramatic. Sometimes they're quiet. A refusal to respond. A complete withdrawal. A stillness that lasts too long. And when it happens, the system responds the only way it knows how. With more control. More restriction. More isolation. But here's the question that lingers. Can you contain something that's happening inside a person's mind, using only walls and rules? Because what happens next suggests the answer isn't so simple. ADX Florence is often described as a success. There are no large-scale riots. No organized violence. No chaos spreading from cell to cell. From the outside it appears stable. Controlled. Effective. But that control comes at a cost. A cost measured not in incidents, but in human experience. In what it does to a person to live without touch. Without conversation. Without unpredictability. Because control doesn't just suppress behavior. It reshapes it. It narrows it. Until what remains is something quieter. More contained. But also, more fragile. And that fragility raises a question that extends far beyond the walls of this prison. What is the purpose of a place like this? Is it to punish? To prevent? Or simply, to isolate what cannot be managed anywhere else? For a small number of inmates, there is a possibility of leaving ADX Florence. Transfer to a less restrictive facility. A gradual return to some form of interaction. But the transition isn't simple. After years in isolation, even basic social contact can feel overwhelming. Eye contact, conversation, noise. Things most people take for granted become difficult to process. Some adjust, slowly. Others struggle in ways that aren't immediately visible. Because the effects of isolation don't end when the cell door opens. They follow. In habits, in thought patterns, in the way the world is perceived. And for many, that adjustment becomes its own kind of challenge. One that doesn't come with clear rules or structure. Just uncertainty. Inside ADX Florence, silence is constant. It fills the spaces between footsteps. It lingers after every door closes. It becomes part of the environment, as real as the walls themselves. But it's not empty. It carries something. The weight of time. The strain of isolation. The quiet presence of hundreds of individuals, each experiencing that silence in their own way. And beyond those walls, life continues. Unaware. Unchanged. Because what happens here is designed to stay contained. Out of sight. Out of reach. Out of mind. ADX Florence was built to solve a problem. To contain individuals considered too dangerous for any other system. And in many ways, it succeeds. But the deeper you look, the more complex the picture becomes. Because this isn't just a story about security. It's a story about what happens when control becomes absolute. When silence replaces interaction. When time stretches without meaning. And when human beings are left alone, for longer than the mind was ever meant to endure. Some adapt. Some resist. Some change in ways that can't be undone. And that leaves one final question. Not about the inmates. Not about the system. But about the cost. Because behind every locked door, behind every silent corridor, there's a reality that few will ever see. And once you understand it, it's not something you easily forget. Thanks for watching and kindly subscribe, like and comment for more videos that will be uploaded that you won't like to miss. Thank you and see you again in the next video.